The wedding dress was still white when Naomi Carter ran, though it would not stay that way for long. She had been standing at the altar of the First Baptist Church of Redemption Creek, Colorado, in the late summer of 1878, with the smell of dried flowers and tallow candles thick in the air, when she overheard two of the groomsmen whispering behind a velvet curtain. They did not know she was close. They never thought to check. And what she heard in those next 30 seconds dismantled every plan she had made for her future as cleanly and as finally as an axe through green wood. Her intended, a man named Gerald Ashworth, had not come to Redemption Creek from Denver on account of love, or even on account of her father's generous land holdings along the southern fork of the Animas River. He had come because her father, Franklin Carter, owed Gerald Ashworth a considerable debt from a failed cattle venture 3 seasons prior, and the wedding had been arranged as payment. The land, the house, and Naomi herself, though neither man had apparently bothered to think of her as anything other than an asset in the ledger. She had suspected something was wrong for months. Gerald had never once looked at her the way a man looked at a woman he wanted to spend his life beside. He looked at her the way a man looked at a field he intended to plow for profit. But she had told herself she was being dramatic. She had told herself love could grow in the spaces between two careful people. She did not tell herself that anymore. Naomi had slipped out of the side door of the church before the organ began its processional. She had walked quickly through the alley behind the millinery shop, then faster past the livery, and then she had simply run, gathering the heavy skirts of her wedding gown in both fists, running north along the creek trail because north was the only direction that pointed away from all of it. She did not go back to her father's house. She could not face him yet, not with the weight of his betrayal sitting so freshly on her chest. She did not return to the church. She had no money, no coat, no horse, and no plan. She had only the dress on her back, the small pearl earrings her late mother had left her, and a ferocious, burning need to be somewhere that was not there. By the time the September sun had moved a quarter of its arc across the sky, Naomi was deep into the foothills, and the wedding dress was streaked brown along the hem from the muddy creek bank she had crossed twice. The silk bodice had caught on a scrub oak branch and torn along the left shoulder. One of her white satin shoes had lost its small heel somewhere back on the rocky trail, and she was walking unevenly, her feet aching, her breath coming hard in the thin mountain air. She did not know exactly where she was. She knew the general shape of the San Juan foothills well enough, having ridden these edges with her older brother Thomas during childhood summers before he had gone east to study law, and then married a woman in Philadelphia who apparently found Colorado insufficiently civilized. But riding familiar hills as a girl on a good horse was a different matter entirely from stumbling through them on foot in a ruined wedding dress, with the afternoon shadows growing longer and the temperature beginning its sharp mountain drop. By late afternoon, she was truly lost. The trail she had been following had split twice, and she had guessed wrong both times, ending up in a thick stand of aspen that gave no clear direction out. Her feet were bleeding. The torn shoulder of the dress let cold air in with every step. She had drunk from a creek she hoped was clean and eaten nothing since a few bites of bread that morning, because brides were supposed to arrive at the altar with a certain ethereal lightness, or so Mrs. Hooper, the dressmaker, had advised her. She sat down on a fallen log and pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed very carefully for a full minute. She would not weep. She had wept enough in the months of that courtship, quiet private tears in the dark of her room when something Gerald said or did not say made her feel like a piece of furniture being arranged for company. She was done weeping for that. What she needed now was warmth and direction and something to eat, and she would feel like herself again and figure out what came next. It was while she was sitting on that log, breathing carefully and talking sense to herself, that she smelled smoke. Wood smoke. Clean and sharp, the kind that came from dry pine burning in a stone-ringed fire, not the coal and refuse smoke of town. It came from uphill and slightly west, and it was close enough that she could smell it clearly over the pine resin and the cold creek air. She stood. She smoothed the wrecked skirt of her dress as best she could, which accomplished very little, and she followed the smell. The camp was in a shallow bowl of land just below a granite outcropping, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides by the rock and a dense stand of Engelmann spruce. It was not the kind of camp a person made for a single night. There was a lean-to structure with a sound roof of spruce boughs layered over a frame of peeled poles, and a stone fire ring that had clearly been used for many seasons. The surrounding rocks blackened and settled with permanence. A large canvas tarpaulin was stretched between 2 trees, creating a dry storage area where Naomi could see stacked wood, several bundles of dried herbs and meat, and an assortment of tools whose purposes she could not all identify. A good horse, a broad dark bay with a patient expression, was tied to a picket line near the tree line and munching unhurriedly at the remains of the afternoon grass. A man was crouched at the fire with his back to her, feeding the flames from a small pile of kindling. He was large. Not in the way of a fat man, but in the way of a man who had spent years doing physical work that had built him like the landscape he lived in, broad across the shoulders, deep through the chest, with forearms that showed below rolled sleeves even in the cooling air. He wore canvas trousers and a heavy flannel shirt the color of old pine bark, and his dark hair curled slightly at the back of his neck where it was getting long. He had a hat on the ground beside him, and a battered rifle leaning against a nearby tree within easy reach, which was the habit of a man who had learned not to leave it far away. He had not heard her yet. The fire was making enough noise, and she had come in from downwind. Naomi stood at the edge of the trees, and for a moment she was simply afraid, because she was a woman alone in the mountains in a ruined dress, and this was a stranger's camp, and she did not know what kind of stranger he was. But the cold was coming down fast now, and her feet hurt, and she had learned something today about what happened when you let fear make your choices for you. So she stepped into the clearing and said, in the clearest voice she could manage, "I am sorry to trouble you. I am lost, and I wonder if I might warm myself by your fire." The man was on his feet and had the rifle in his hands before she had finished the sentence, which was fast enough that she took a step back by pure instinct. But he did not raise it toward her. He turned with it held low and looked at her, and the expression on his face moved through several distinct stages in the space of 2 seconds: alarm, confusion, and then something that was not quite either of those things, something more careful and more attentive than either. He was younger than she had expected, somewhere in his early 30s by the look of him, with a strong jaw carrying several days of dark beard and eyes that were a pale gray-green, the color of the lichen that grew on the shaded side of granite. There was a scar along his left jaw, old and neat, the kind a person acquired when they were young and did not take proper care afterward. His face was weathered but not hard. There was a quality in his expression that she would not have expected, a kind of steadiness that came not from coldness but from being a man who had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He looked at her for a long moment. The torn white dress, the muddy hem, the bloody feet visible below it, the pearl earring still perfectly in place, which probably looked stranger than anything else. "You are not exactly what I was expecting to come out of those trees," he said. His voice was low, a baritone that fit the mountain landscape the way a river fit its canyon. There was nothing threatening in it. "I imagine not," Naomi said. He set the rifle back against the tree with the deliberate care of a man making a point of doing so, and he gestured toward the fire. "Come and get warm. You look frozen through." She walked toward the fire and held her hands out to it, and the heat was so immediately and intensely welcome that she had to press her teeth together to keep from making an embarrassing noise. Her fingers had gone numb without her noticing. "Frederick Calloway," the man said from the other side of the fire. He did not offer his hand across the flames, but the introduction was clear and straightforward. "Naomi Carter," she said. There was a pause. Naomi Carter, he repeated, and something shifted slightly in his expression, not recognition exactly, but a kind of heightened attention. You are not from out here, your shoes say town. She looked down at her ruined satin shoe and its missing heel. Redemption Creek, she said. That is 12 miles south and east of here, he said. I know, she said. Or I thought I knew. I lost the trail. He looked at her dress again, at the whole picture of her without being rude about it, the way a man looked when he was trying to understand what he was seeing and was too honest to pretend he already did. The occasion, he said carefully, looks like it was a formal one. It was supposed to be a wedding, Naomi said. Supposed to be. The wedding did not happen, she said. I left before it could. She lifted her chin slightly because she was not going to apologize for any of it, not to a stranger or to anyone else. I understand that is probably an unusual thing for a woman to do. I have seen more unusual things, Frederick Calloway said evenly. He moved around the fire and crouched near a canvas pack that was stowed beside the lean-to, and he came back with a folded wool blanket that he held out to her across the fire. Put this around you. That dress is not doing anything useful against the cold. She took the blanket and wrapped it over her shoulders, and the warmth of it was extraordinary. It smelled of pine smoke and horse and something clean underneath both of those. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and went back to his side of the fire and crouched again in that easy way of a man who was comfortable with the ground, his forearms resting on his knees, watching the fire with the kind of patient attention a person developed when they spent a great deal of time alone with their own thoughts. Where were you trying to go? He asked. Away, Naomi said. Then she shook her head because that was not a useful answer. I do not know exactly, somewhere that was not there. He was quiet for a moment. He took a tin cup from near the fire and poured something from a small pot that had been heating on a flat stone at the fire's edge, and he held it out to her. She came around the fire to take it, which meant coming closer to him, close enough to see the pale green of his eyes more clearly. The cup contained dark coffee, strong enough that she could smell it before she even raised it to her lips, and it was the best thing she had tasted in recent memory. You can stay here tonight, Frederick said. It will be full dark in an hour and you cannot navigate those trails without light. I will take you back to Redemption Creek in the morning if that is where you want to go. It is not where I want to go, she said honestly. He looked up from the fire at that. All right, he said without pressing her. We can discuss that in the morning. Tonight you eat something and sleep inside the lean-to. It is warm enough and dry. I will sleep outside. That is your home, Naomi said. I am not displacing you from it. You are a guest, he said, with a quiet finality that was not an argument but simply a statement of how things were going to be. She watched him for a moment. There was something in the way he said it that she had never quite heard from a man before. Not the performance of gentlemanliness that Gerald Ashworth had maintained in company, that careful social construction designed to impress and persuade. This was something simpler and more solid than that. He meant what he said, and the meaning of it was only what it appeared to be. You are safe here, Frederick Calloway said, and he met her eyes when he said it. I want you to know that. Naomi Carter, who had spent the better part of the last year learning not to trust easy reassurances from men, felt something in those words settle into her chest like a stone into still water. Not because it was a charming thing to say, because he said it the way a man stated a fact about the landscape. The mountain is north. The creek is cold. You are safe here. She believed him. She sat down on a clean split log he had positioned near the fire, and she drank the coffee and let the warmth return to her hands and her feet, and she looked up at the darkening sky above the granite outcropping where the first stars were appearing with that extraordinary mountain clarity, and she thought, for the first time all day, that things might be all right eventually. Frederick cooked a simple supper over the fire, salt pork and dried beans that he had soaked that morning, and hardtack that was better than it had any right to be. He said very little while he cooked, but the silence was not uncomfortable. He moved around his camp with the efficiency of a man who had a place for everything and had long since stopped thinking about it, and there was a peacefulness to watching him that Naomi noticed and filed away without examining too closely. "How long have you been living up here?" she asked when they were eating. 3 years in this camp," he said. "Before that I was moving around more. Trapping, scouting for a survey crew out of Fort Garland for 2 seasons. Before that the Army, but that was a long time ago." "What do you do now?" she asked. "Hunt and trap through the winter. I sell furs and some dried meat to the trading post in Tin Cup. In the summer I take out hunting parties sometimes, men from back east who want to say they shot an elk in the Rocky Mountains." He said this last part with a faint, dry amusement that she found she liked. "You prefer the winter work," she said. He looked at her with a hint of surprise. "Yes," he said. "How did you know that?" "You said the summer work in a different tone," she said. He considered this. "The Eastern gentlemen," he said carefully, "are not always comfortable with the reality of the mountains when they arrive. They imagine something more like a painting. And it is not like a painting. It is more interesting than a painting," he said, "but they do not always agree." She laughed. It came out before she thought to moderate it, a real laugh, warm and sudden, and it surprised her because she had not expected to laugh today of all days. Frederick Calloway looked at her when she laughed, and something moved through his expression that she could not quite name, something that came and went quickly but left a faint warmth in his eyes that had not been there before. After supper he showed her the lean-to, which was more comfortable than she had any right to expect. There was a sleeping platform of peeled poles covered with a thick layer of spruce boughs and several folded blankets, and the structure was well enough built that the wind did not come through. He gave her a dry shirt from his pack that was enormously too large but was clean and warm, and she changed into it behind the lean-to screen with the wedding dress coming off over her head for the last time. She held it for a moment in her hands. The dress her father had commissioned from a dressmaker in Durango. 6 yards of ivory silk and Brussels lace, the most expensive thing she had ever worn. She thought about Gerald Ashworth and her father's ledger, and the way 2 men had between them decided the course of her entire life, without consulting the person most affected by it. She folded the dress and set it neatly in the corner of the lean-to, and lay down on the sleeping platform, and pulled the blankets up to her chin, and she thought about what she was going to do. She had no money. She had the pearl earrings. She had her own mind and her own 2 hands, and apparently considerably more determination than anyone in Redemption Creek had given her credit for. She fell asleep faster than she expected, lulled by the crackle of the fire outside and the deep mountain silence beyond it, and the extraordinary physical exhaustion of having walked 12 miles through the foothills in a wedding dress. She did not know that Frederick Calloway sat by his fire for a long time after she slept, not doing anything in particular, only sitting and looking into the flames with the expression of a man trying to work something out that he did not yet have the language for. She woke in the gray, early light to the sound of him already up and moving around camp, and the smell of coffee again, and something else, cornmeal, frying in a pan with some kind of dried fruit worked into it. She lay still for a moment and looked at the spruce bough ceiling of the lean-to and thought about where she was, and how she had gotten here and what it meant. She got up and came out and sat by the fire, and Frederick handed her coffee without being asked, and they ate the cornmeal in a companionable quiet while the early light turned from gray to the particular clear gold of mountain mornings that she had always loved. "The town will be looking for you," he said, not accusingly, just factually. "Possibly," she said, "or they will be furious with me and simply glad I have removed myself from the situation." "Which is it, do you think?" she considered. "My father will be looking for me. Not out of love, particularly, but because my disappearance is an inconvenience to his arrangements." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to smooth it away. "Gerald Ashworth will want to know what happened to the property he was promised, though I imagine calling off a wedding in a small town involves enough social difficulty that he may simply cut his losses and go back to Denver." Frederick was quiet for a moment. "What was the plan?" he asked. "When you ran, did you have somewhere in mind?" "I had no plan," she said. I had only the knowledge that I could not stand there and marry a man who saw me as a line item in a business transaction. That is a reasonable objection to a marriage. Not everyone would agree, she said. There are people in Redemption Creek who would tell you I had a fine opportunity and threw it away on sentiment. Sentiment, Frederick Calloway said, with that same dry, precise quality she had noticed the night before. People use that word when they want to dismiss something real. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, but the line of his jaw was thoughtful. "What do you know about it?" she asked. Not unkindly, just curious. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I was engaged once, 8 years ago. She was a woman in San Antonio, daughter of a cattleman. Her father decided I was not sufficient for what he had in mind for her future. He found someone more suitable, meaning someone with more land and a better name." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "I do not know if she was happy about it. I never got to ask her." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I came west and I made something different out of my life. I do not regret it." He said this with the certainty of a man who had thought about it enough to know it was true. "But I know what it is to have your life arranged by other people, and I know what it costs." They sat with that between them for a while, and the morning deepened and the birds started up in the spruce trees above them, and the bay horse moved on its picket line and blew a long, satisfied breath through its nose. "I cannot go back to Redemption Creek," Naomi said finally. "Not yet, not like this." She looked down at the oversized shirt she was wearing, her bare feet, the remnants of her situation. "I need time to think, to figure out what I am going to do." Frederick Calloway looked at her for a long moment with those pale green eyes that seemed to take in more than most people's eyes did. Then he said, "I need to ride into Tin Cup in 2 days for supplies and to sell some hides. It is a day's ride north. There is a boarding house there run by a widow named Mrs. Agnes Harlow, who is a decent woman and not given to gossip. You could stay there while you decide what to do next. I can stake you for a week's board." "I will not take your money," Naomi said. "It is a loan," he said simply. "If you decide to repay it one day, that is fine. If not, it is a small sum and I will not lose sleep over it." She looked at him. He was entirely serious and entirely without any suggestion that the offer came with conditions. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not know me." Frederick considered the question with the same careful honesty he seemed to bring to everything. "I know enough," he said. "I know you walked 12 miles through mountain trails in satin shoes to get away from something that was wrong. I know you held your chin up when you walked into a stranger's camp when you were frightened and cold. I know you have not asked me for anything you did not need." He paused. "That is enough to know that you deserve a fair chance at sorting things out." Naomi sat with that for a long moment, feeling something she could not quite articulate, something warm and careful, like a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. "All right," she said. "Tin Cup. Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Frederick," he said. "Frederick," she agreed. The 2 days before they left for Tin Cup were unlike anything in Naomi's experience, and that was partly uncomfortable and partly the most interesting she had felt in years. Frederick Calloway's camp was a working place, organized around the rhythms of the mountain and the practical necessities of a man who lived by his own labor, and he did not alter those rhythms for her presence. He went out each morning to check his trap lines, returning by midday with whatever he had caught, and he spent his afternoons curing hides and maintaining his tools and equipment with the careful attention of someone who understood that a broken trap or a poorly maintained rifle could be the difference between a good season and a poor one. Naomi did not sit still while he worked. She did not know how. She asked him questions, and he answered them with a directness that she appreciated enormously. No hedging, no managing of her understanding because she was a woman and might find certain things unsuitable. He showed her how to stretch a beaver hide on a willow frame, and she worked beside him for an afternoon doing it, and her arms ached pleasantly afterward. He showed her how he read the weather from the color of the sky above the granite peaks and the behavior of the animals on the hillside. And she listened to all of it with the attention of someone who was rebuilding her understanding of what her life could look like. In the evenings they talked. Really talked, the kind of conversation Naomi had not had in a very long time, possibly not since Thomas had gone east, because Gerald Ashworth had not been interested in her thoughts, and her father, though not unkind, was not a man who had ever learned to listen to a woman as though she were worth listening to. Frederick Calloway was different. He asked her questions and then actually attended to her answers, and when she said something he disagreed with, he said so plainly, and they argued it out in that pleasant way of two people who are genuinely interested in finding out whether they are right. She told him about her childhood on the Animas River, about her mother, Naomi Carter, who had died of fever when Naomi was 14, and who had been the person in the family who really saw her. About the years after, managing her father's household and teaching herself to read the agricultural reports he brought home, because the land was going to be hers someday, and she wanted to understand it. About the small school in Redemption Creek, where she had taught for 2 years before her father had decided it was time she married and produced grandchildren for him, which he had phrased more diplomatically, but which was what it amounted to. Frederick listened to all of this with the same steady, unhurried attention he gave everything. And she found herself noticing more things about him as the days went by. The way his whole face changed when he was amused by something, a deep crease appearing at the corner of his left eye before the smile reached his mouth. The careful, precise way he moved his large hands when he was working on something delicate, like splicing a broken trace line or writing in the small leather-bound journal he kept with notes on weather patterns and animal movements. The way he talked about the mountains, not with the breathless enthusiasm of a newcomer, but with the deep, quiet love of a person who had chosen this place and been chosen back by it. She thought about him more than was probably sensible, given her circumstances. On the morning of the 3rd day they broke camp early, Frederick loading the horse with his bundles of cured hides and the small pack Naomi had assembled from the things he could spare. And she rode the bay because he said flatly that he had walked those trails enough times that another few miles was nothing to him. They went north along a ridge trail that opened up spectacular views of the San Juan peaks to the southwest, white-capped even in September, and Naomi sat on the horse and looked at the landscape she had grown up adjacent to without ever really seeing, and felt something new and unnameable moving around inside her chest. They talked as they walked. He told her about the mountains, about the ecology of the tree lines, and the way the elk moved through the seasons, and the old trapper routes that predated the settlements by generations, some of them going back to Spanish explorers 2 centuries before. He knew the history of this country the way someone knew the history of their own family, with that specific intimacy that came from being present in a place long enough for its past to become personal. She told him about a book she had read 3 times, Jane Eyre, which her schoolteacher Miss Delia Franks had lent her when she was 15, and which she had loved passionately for reasons she had not fully understood at the time, and understood somewhat better now. The part that matters in that book, Naomi said, is not the romance. It is the part where she refuses to compromise herself, where she says she would rather have respect than love if she cannot have both. Can you not have both? Frederick asked. Most women are told they cannot, she said. Most women are told to be grateful for the love and not to worry about the respect. He was quiet for a moment. That seems like a poor bargain, he said. It is a terrible bargain, she said firmly. And I spent 2 years in a courtship accepting a version of it without realizing what I was doing, and then one day in a church I woke up and understood that I was 30 seconds from making it permanent. How old are you? He asked. She noticed that he asked it the way he asked everything, directly and without apology. 26, she said. I am 32, he said, as though that was the natural follow-up which she supposed it was. They came down into the valley where Tin Cup sat in the late afternoon. The town arranged along a single main street with the characteristic improvised permanence of Colorado mountain settlements, frame buildings that had been expanded as needed, a smelter at the south end from the silver mining that had drawn people here in the first place, a church, a general store, a saloon, and a scattering of houses going up the hillside behind the main street in varying states of completion. Frederick took her first to the boarding house, which sat at the north end of town, a solid two-story frame building with a kitchen garden still producing late squash and dried bean vines along the fence. Mrs. Agnes Harlow answered the door herself, a compact woman of about 50 with sharp gray eyes and the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now interesting, which was the better outcome by far. She looked at Naomi taking in the oversized flannel shirt and the ruined satin shoe with its missing heel, and whatever other evidence of recent adventure was still visible, and then she looked at Frederick with an expression that communicated several things at once without words. "Mrs. Harlow," Frederick said, "this is Naomi Carter. She has had a difficult few days and needs a room and some time. I will cover the first week's board." Mrs. Harlow looked at Naomi with those sharp eyes that saw everything clearly and judged nothing harshly. "Come in," she said. "I have a room on the second floor with a view of the mountain, and I will have the kitchen girl heat water for a bath because I imagine you could use one." "I could," Naomi admitted. "Thank you." She turned to Frederick. He was standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, and that steady, unhurried quality he always had, and she felt suddenly and unexpectedly reluctant to go inside. "I will come back through town in 10 days, he said. "If you want to talk about what you have decided by then." "I would like that," she said. He nodded once, with that slight warmth in his eyes that she was learning to watch for, and he put his hat back on and went down the porch steps and back toward the trading post with the easy stride of a man who moved comfortably through the world. Naomi stood on the porch for a moment after he had gone and then went inside. The bath was extraordinary. She sat in the tin tub with the hot water going slowly cool around her, and she thought about Frederick Calloway, which she recognized was perhaps not the most practical use of her time, and she thought about the land along the Animas River that she had grown up on, and which her father intended to hand to Gerald Ashworth, and she thought about what her actual options were. She had the pearl earrings. She had the education she had given herself. She had the teaching experience from the school in Redemption Creek. She did not have money or a home, but she had herself, which she was beginning to suspect was more than she had given herself credit for. Mrs. Agnes Harlow proved to be exactly what Frederick had described, a decent woman and not given to gossip, and something more than that. Over the following days, she provided Naomi with more practical assistance than she asked for and less advice than most people in her situation would have offered. She produced a dress, plain gray wool, that had belonged to her daughter who had married and gone to Pueblo, and she produced a pair of boots that were a size large but sound, and she did not ask Naomi for the whole story, though she clearly understood the general shape of it. The other boarders were a surveyor named Mr. Alistair Webb, who was mapping claims for a mining company, and a couple, John and Clara Tanner, who were looking for land to homestead and passing through on their way further north. The Tanners were young, not yet 25, and very much in love in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who had not yet had to work at it, and Naomi found herself watching them with a feeling that was not quite envy but was adjacent to it. On the 5th day, a rider came into Tin Cup from the south. He stopped at the trading post and he asked questions. Naomi was in the trading post at the time, buying a small journal and a stub of pencil to write down thoughts she could not keep organized in her head alone. She was standing at the back counter when she heard him at the front. "I am looking for a woman," the rider said. "Dark hair, about so tall, 26 years old, name of Naomi Carter. She went missing from Redemption Creek 9 days ago, and there is concern for her welfare." Naomi stayed very still behind a shelf of canned goods. The man behind the trading post counter, a broad-shouldered Swede named Henriksen, said slowly, Can't say I've seen anyone by that description." The writer was not Gerald Ashworth. He was a younger man, late 20s, wearing a dusty coat and a badge that read Deputy Sheriff. His name, Naomi learned later, was Deputy Roy Culver, and he had been sent north by Sheriff Tate of Redemption Creek on account of Franklin Carter's considerable political influence in that county. She slipped out the back of the trading post and walked quickly back to Mrs. Harlow's boarding house and sat on her bed and thought very rapidly. She was not a criminal. She had not done anything wrong. She had the right to be, wherever she chose to be, and to decline a marriage she had not consented to in any genuine sense. But the law in 1878 did not always see it that way, particularly when the woman in question had a father with land and a jilted man with a debt claim, and the sheriff of a small county town often saw his interests more clearly aligned with the local landowner than with the landowning's runaway daughter. She needed to talk to Frederick. He was not due back for 5 more days. She sat with that for a moment, and then she made a decision. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Harlow in the kitchen and told her quickly and plainly the full situation: the debt, the wedding, the running, the deputy downstairs at the trading post. Mrs. Harlow listened with her arms crossed and an expression that grew progressively more displeased, not at Naomi, but at the general category of events being described. "Men," she said, when Naomi had finished, in a tone that contained an entire editorial. "I need to get word to Frederick Calloway," Naomi said. "Do you know how to reach him?" "I know where his camp is, roughly," Mrs. Harlow said. "My neighbor's boy sometimes earns a few cents carrying messages up to the trappers in the hills. He knows the trails." She paused. "But it will take a day at least to reach him and a day back." "Can the boy go today?" "If I ask him to," Mrs. Harlow said firmly. "You are going to stay inside this house tonight. The deputy has probably already spoken to Henriksen at the trading post, and Henriksen is a good man, but he is not complicated. He will not lie, but he will not volunteer anything. I will not lie either, but I will not answer questions I am not asked." "I do not want you to be dishonest on my account," Naomi said. "I am not planning to be dishonest," Mrs. Harlow said. "I am planning to be unhelpful, which is a different thing and entirely within my rights." Naomi spent an anxious day and a half inside the boarding house, reading and writing in her journal and having long, quiet conversations with Clara Tanner, who had guessed the general shape of the situation with the perceptive accuracy of a young woman who paid attention to people. "What will you do if they make you go back?" Clara asked. "I do not know," Naomi said honestly. "I will not marry Gerald Ashworth, that much I am certain of. Beyond that, I am still working it out. Do you know what you want?" Clara asked. It was a simple question, and it landed with more force than questions usually did. Naomi thought about the camp in the foothills. "The fire and the coffee and the man who said you are safe here," and meant it. The way 2 days in those mountains had felt more like herself than the 2 years before had. "I am beginning to," she said. Frederick rode into Tin Cup at midday of the 2nd day, which meant he had ridden through the night after receiving her message. Mrs. Harlow let him in and took his hat and gave him coffee and pointed him toward the back sitting room where Naomi was waiting. And then she went back to her kitchen, with the discreet tact of a woman who understood what spaces to leave open. He came into the sitting room still wearing his riding coat, trail dusty and clearly tired, and the first thing he did was look at her with those pale green eyes and determine, apparently to his satisfaction, that she was all right. "The deputy," he said. "He is still in town, I think," she said. "I do not believe he has found me yet, but it is only a matter of time. Tin Cup is not large." Frederick sat down across from her and set his coffee cup on the small table between them. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to not be sent back to Redemption Creek against my will," she said. "I want to have the chance to settle my own affairs on my own terms. I want to talk to my father myself, not be delivered to him by a deputy sheriff like I am property that has been recovered." She paused. "And I want to not have to marry Gerald Ashworth." "The last one is the simplest," Frederick said. "No one can force you to marry anyone. The law in this county may disagree, she said. The law in this county is Sheriff Tate, Frederick said, with that same careful, precise quality, who I happen to know is a personal friend of Franklin Carter from their time in the territorial legislature together. That is a relevant fact. Naomi looked at him. How do you know that? I have been living in these mountains for 3 years, he said. I do not live in town, but I am not uninformed. I know the people who matter in this part of Colorado, and I know their connections. He turned the cup in his hands. There is also a Judge Marcus Hardin in Gunnison City who is known to be fair and who has a reputation for not being particularly sympathetic to men who treat women as contractual fulfillments. Getting your situation in front of him before Tate gets involved is the better path. She stared at him. You have been thinking about this since you received my message. For about 18 hours, he said. She did not know what to do with that. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them, and then she looked back up at him. Frederick, why are you doing all of this? He looked at her for a long moment with that same steady attention that she had come to rely on without realizing she was relying on it. I think you know why, he said quietly. The room was very still. Through the window she could hear the street sounds of tin cup, horses, and a distant hammer and someone calling across the road. And inside the room there was the soft pop of the coal stove and her own heartbeat, which had accelerated somewhat. I may know why, she said carefully, but I would like to hear you say it. Because you matter to me, Frederick said. Simple and direct, and without any of the elaborate rhetorical construction that men used when they wanted to say something significant without quite committing to it. You have mattered to me since you walked out of those trees in a ruined dress with your chin up, and you have mattered to me more with each day since. I am not in a position to ask anything of you. You have too many things that need sorting out first, and you have known me for 10 days. But I am telling you because you deserve to hear it plainly. Naomi sat with that for a moment. She thought about the 2 years of courtship with Gerald Ashworth, during which he had never once said anything that real to her, never once offered her something that had nothing in it but the truth of what he felt. 10 days is not very long, she said. No, he agreed. I have not known you very long, she said. No, he said again. But I know, Naomi said, that you rode through the night to get here after receiving my message. And I know that you said I was safe, and you meant it to include more than just the immediate situation. And I know that when you listen to me talk, you actually hear what I say. She looked at him steadily. I have been alive 26 years, and I have not always encountered that. Something in his expression shifted, that deep crease at the corner of his left eye appearing a fraction before the warmth reached the rest of his face. I am not going anywhere, he said quietly. Good, she said, because I am not either. But first I need to deal with a deputy and a father and probably a judge. Yes, he said, one thing at a time. The one thing they dealt with first was Deputy Roy Culver, who found them that same afternoon, or rather who found Frederick Calloway coming out of Henrikson's trading post and recognized the name when Frederick introduced himself and made the connection to the woman who had come through. Deputy Culver was, as it turned out, a young man of reasonable intelligence and no particular malice who was primarily doing his job and had some doubts about aspects of it. Frederick spoke to him plainly. Naomi Carter was not missing. She was a grown woman of 26 years who had left a situation she found untenable and gone where she chose to go. She was not in any danger. She was not in any legal difficulty. Deputy Culver's assignment was to locate her and confirm her welfare, and both of those objectives had now been met. Deputy Culver, to his credit, thought about this for a while. Mr. Carter is asking for his daughter to be returned home, he said. Mr. Carter can ask, Frederick said. He cannot compel, she is not a minor. More thinking. There is the matter of the financial arrangement with Mr. Ashworth, Culver said uncomfortably. That is a civil matter between two men, Frederick said. It has nothing to do with Miss Carter, and she is not party to it and cannot be held responsible for it. Culver rubbed the back of his neck. He was, Naomi thought, a man who was going to make a better deputy once he got a few years of perspective on him. If I could speak to Miss Carter directly, he said. Just to confirm she is here of her own choosing and her welfare is satisfactory. Naomi stepped forward from where she had been standing behind Frederick. It is, she said. I am here of my own choosing. My welfare is satisfactory. I will be returning to Redemption Creek in my own time to speak with my father directly, but I will not be returned like a stray animal. I trust that answers what you need. Deputy Culver looked at her and then at Frederick and then back at her. He sighed. It answers what I need, he said. I will report that Miss Carter is well and acting under her own agency. What I report about anything else is my own business. He left Tin Cup the following morning, and Naomi stood on Mrs. Harlow's porch and watched him ride south and felt the first genuine easing of the tension she had been carrying since the church. The journey to Redemption Creek, when she finally made it, was 3 days later, and she did not make it alone. Frederick rode south with her at her request, not because she needed his protection in any simple physical sense, but because she wanted someone beside her who would not try to manage what she said or how she said it, and he was the person she trusted most for that. Franklin Carter met them at the door of his house on the Animas River, a compact, weathered man in his late 50s with Naomi's same dark eyes and none of her warmth. He looked at Frederick Calloway with the assessment of a man who made quick calculations, and then at his daughter with an expression that moved through several layers, anger and relief and guilt in a complicated order. The conversation was not easy. It was honest, which made it harder than the easy conversations but infinitely more valuable. Naomi told her father plainly what she had heard behind the velvet curtain in the church, and she told him what it meant, and she told him what she was going to do about it, which was this. She was not going to marry Gerald Ashworth. She was never going to marry anyone for the purpose of settling a debt, and she would like her father to think carefully about whether the choices he had made were the choices of a man who respected his own daughter. Franklin Carter was silent for a long time. Frederick sat quietly in the corner of the room and said nothing, which was exactly right. Finally Franklin said, I did not think of it as not respecting you. I know, Naomi said, and her voice was gentler now. That is part of what makes it hard. You did not think of it that way because you did not think about how I would experience it. You solved a problem you had, and I was the most convenient solution. That is what I need you to understand. Franklin was quiet. He was a man who was not accustomed to being confronted this plainly, particularly not by his daughter. But he was also, underneath his limitations, a man who was not entirely without the capacity for honesty, and after a while he said, I suppose I have not been entirely fair to you. No, she said, but you can be different going forward. The matter of Gerald Ashworth resolved itself with an anticlimactic practicality that was, in retrospect, entirely appropriate. Gerald, informed by Deputy Culver that the situation was not going to produce the outcome he had expected, had already begun correspondence with a lawyer in Denver regarding the original debt, which he apparently preferred to collect in money rather than in the form of a recalcitrant woman who had run away on the wedding day. Franklin Carter, faced with the reality of paying the debt in actual currency, was extremely unhappy but ultimately capable of arranging it. The land along the Animas stayed with the Carters. The debt was settled over the following months in payments. Gerald Ashworth returned to Denver, and within a year had married a woman there who, by all accounts, was entirely satisfied with the arrangement, and whose father's ledgers were apparently much tidier than Franklin Carter's had been. Naomi spent 2 weeks in her father's house in that September of 1878, sorting through what was hers and having the slow, difficult, ultimately worthwhile conversations with Franklin Carter that she had never had while she was simply living under his roof, trying not to disturb the peace. It was not a transformation. Franklin Carter was the same man he had always been, with the same habits and the same limitations. But something between them shifted into a more honest register, and that was something. Frederick stayed in Redemption Creek those 2 weeks. He was not idle. He found useful work with no difficulty, because a man who knew the mountains and could handle horses and was not afraid of hard labor was always useful in a Colorado town, and he made himself modestly but genuinely indispensable to a couple of the local ranchers who needed fencing done before winter set in. He had a room above the livery stable, and he ate supper at the town's small dining room most evenings, and Naomi found reasons to be walking past the livery stable or the dining room more often than pure coincidence would suggest. They took walks along the Animas River in the long autumn evenings when the cottonwood leaves had gone gold, and the light on the water was extraordinary, and they talked about everything and nothing in the easy way of two people who had discovered that conversation with each other was simply one of the better things available. He told her more about his childhood in Virginia, which had been comfortable enough until the war had come through and dismantled it, and about the years after when he had gone west because west was where a man without prospects could still make something. She told him more about her mother, and about the things her mother had taught her, and about the shape of the life she had imagined for herself when she allowed herself to imagine it. One evening they were sitting on a flat rock above the river with the last of the sunset going orange and pink behind the San Juan peaks, and Frederick was quiet for a while and then he said, "I have been thinking about next year." "What about it?" she asked. "My cabin," he said. "I have been meaning to build a proper one for 2 seasons and I keep putting it off because it seemed like too large an undertaking for one person." He paused. "It seems less large an undertaking for 2 people." Naomi looked at him. The dying light was warm on his face, and the look in his pale green eyes was careful and direct, and contained everything he was not quite saying in the exact shape of the thing he was saying. "Are you asking me something, Frederick?" she said. "I am getting there," he said, with that faint, dry quality that she had loved from nearly the first. He turned toward her on the flat rock so they were facing each other, and he took both of her hands in his, which were large and warm and entirely steady. "I am not a man with a great deal to offer in the conventional sense," he said. "I have no house at the moment and limited cash money, and my primary holdings are a good horse, a reliable rifle, and a working knowledge of about 40 square miles of Rocky Mountain wilderness." "Those are not nothing," she said. "They are not nothing," he agreed. "But they are not what you were promised with Gerald Ashworth." "What I was promised with Gerald Ashworth was a cage with nice curtains," she said. That crease appeared at the corner of his left eye. "I love you," he said, simple and direct and without any of the elaborate scaffolding people usually built around those 3 words. "I have loved you since somewhere around the 2nd day, which I understand is not a great deal of time, but I have learned in 32 years that knowing what you know when you know it is better than waiting for permission to know it. I would like to marry you, Naomi. I would like to build a life with you in the mountains, and I would like to do it in a way where you have equal say in every decision and your opinions are considered to be as valuable as mine, which they are." Naomi sat looking at him with the river going dark below them and the first stars appearing above the peaks, and she thought about the church in Redemption Creek, and the velvet curtain, and running barefoot in the mountains, and a stranger's camp with a fire and coffee, and a voice that said you are safe here, and meant it from the first moment. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since somewhere around the morning of the 2nd day as well, which I also understand is not very long." "It has been almost a month now," he said. "It has," she agreed. "That is somewhat longer." "And you still love me," he said. "More," she said. He smiled at that, the full smile that transformed his face, and he brought her hands up and kissed them, her knuckles, the back of her right hand, and then he looked at her with everything he had just said still present in his eyes and something additional now, a kind of completeness, a settling, like a piece of country finally mapped. "Yes," she said before he could ask again, and she was already leaning toward him. They married in December of 1878, in the small church in Tin Cup, because Naomi did not particularly want to be married in the First Baptist Church of Redemption Creek, and she was fairly sure the congregation there would be uncomfortable about it anyway. Mrs. Agnes Harlow stood as witness. The surveyor Alastair Webb, who turned out to be an unexpectedly sentimental man on the subject of other people's weddings, stood as Frederick's witness and cried quietly into a borrowed handkerchief throughout. Franklin Carter came, which surprised Naomi somewhat and moved her more than she expected. He sat in the second pew in his Sunday coat, weathered and upright, and when the ceremony was done, he took Frederick Calloway's hand and shook it for a long moment without saying much, and then he held his daughter for a moment longer than he usually did and said, quietly, "Your mother would have liked him," which was the most generous thing he knew how to say, and Naomi understood it as such. The dress she wore was not white. It was deep blue wool, practical and warm, and the right thing for a December wedding in the Colorado Mountains, and she had made it herself in the 3 weeks prior with assistance from Clara Tanner, who had come down from further north especially because Naomi had written to tell her about it. She wore her mother's pearl earrings, which she had worn through everything and which looked exactly right. She did not feel like a bride in the way she had been told to expect. With the elaborate, anxious, performative quality of the occasion she had fled in September. She felt like herself, standing next to the person she had chosen and who had chosen her, in a small mountain church while December snow fell quietly outside the windows. Frederick Calloway, in his best dark wool coat that he had bought new for the occasion, looked at her when she came down the short aisle, and his expression was the one she had come to know best, that careful, steady attention that saw everything and judged nothing, and held everything it saw with a kind of reverence. The ceremony was simple. The words were the old ones, to have and to hold, and they both said them with the full weight of people who meant them and understood what meaning them required. Afterward there was a supper at Mrs. Harlow's boarding house with 8 people, and a great deal of food, and a fiddle player from the saloon who played well enough that even Mr. Webb danced, cautiously. Frederick danced with Naomi for a long time, a slow, easy dance that was mostly just the two of them swaying together near the stove, and he held her as though she was the most valuable thing he had ever been entrusted with, which she was coming to understand she was to him. The winter of 1878 into 1879, they spent in a rented cabin on the north edge of Tin Cup, a small, rough place that was cramped and drafty and entirely theirs. Frederick went on with his trapping, and Naomi taught school 3 days a week at the one-room schoolhouse, where the previous teacher had departed in October for reasons that involved a hastily arranged marriage of her own. The school was a rough place, 14 children ranging from 6 to 15, and Naomi managed it with the same combination of genuine warmth and quietly immovable firmness that she applied to most things, and the children loved her for it. In the evenings they were together in the small cabin, and those evenings were the best part of Naomi's life in a way that she had not known evenings could be. Frederick was not a man who needed to fill silence with noise, and neither was she, and they had learned to be comfortably quiet together in the same space, each doing their own work, reading or writing or repairing something, and occasionally looking up to find the other watching them with that particular expression that communicated everything without requiring words. They argued sometimes, real arguments about real things, because they were two strong-willed people with opinions, and the arguments were usually about something worth arguing about, the best approach to a financial decision, or the right way to handle a difficult situation with one of Naomi's students, or what they thought about some piece of news from the wider world. The arguments were always resolved, because they had both agreed without ever formally agreeing to it that unresolved things left to fester were worse than the temporary discomfort of working through them. In the spring of 1879, they began building the cabin. It was further up the mountain than the camp had been, in a place Frederick had identified years before as the best site in his range of country, sheltered on the north and east by a granite ridge, south-facing for winter light, with a spring-fed creek running 20 yards from the proposed location, and a view south toward the San Juan peaks that was simply one of the finer views available in that part of Colorado. They built it themselves with help from two men Frederick knew, former trappers who had decided to settle, men named Del Briggs and Amos Clearwater, who were reliable workers and good company, and who did not ask more questions than they had to about the situation and therefore were enjoyable to spend a day of construction with. The cabin took most of the summer to build properly. It was a good cabin, log construction with tight chinking and a proper stone fireplace, and a porch on the south side where you could sit in the morning with coffee and look at the mountains. Naomi planted a kitchen garden that first summer in the cleared space east of the cabin, and it did better than she had any right to expect given the altitude and the short season, and she felt an enormous proprietary pride in every cabbage and onion and root vegetable that came up, because they were hers and Frederick's and had grown in the ground they had chosen together. There was one afternoon in August of 1879 when they were working on the cabin's interior, Naomi fitting pieces of a pine shelf into a notch Frederick had cut in the wall logs, and he was working on the fireplace hearth behind her, and she heard him put down his tools and go still. She turned around to find him watching her with an expression so unguarded and so full of what it was full of that she had to set down the shelf piece and simply stand and receive it. "What?" she said softly. "Nothing," he said. "Just this. I was just looking at this." She crossed the half-finished room and put her hands on his face, feeling the warmth of him and the slight roughness of his jaw. And she kissed him, standing on the pine shavings and sawdust of their unfinished floor, with the afternoon light coming through the window openings and the mountain wind in the spruce trees outside. They moved into the cabin in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after Naomi had walked out of the trees in her ruined wedding dress. And the first night they lit the fireplace and sat on the porch in the cooling air and looked at the stars above the peaks, and Frederick poured 2 cups of whiskey from a bottle Del Briggs had given them as a housewarming gift, and they sat together in the good quiet. 1 year, Naomi said. 1 year, he agreed. I keep thinking about the version of my life where I did not hear those men talking behind the curtain, she said. Where I went through with it. She shook her head slowly. It is frightening to think about. You would have found your way out eventually, Frederick said. You are not a person who stays somewhere that is wrong for long. I might not have, she said honestly. I might have spent years thinking that was all there was. But you did not, he said. He looked at her with those steady pale green eyes. You ran, in your wedding dress with one heel missing. She laughed softly at that. It was not my most dignified moment. I thought it was the most dignified thing I had ever seen, he said. Someone deciding that the truth of what they needed mattered more than what they had been told to want. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the mountains and breathed in the cold, clean air that smelled of pine and the season turning and the smoke of their own fireplace, and she thought that this was what it felt like when a life fit the person living it. In the winter of 1879, Naomi discovered she was expecting a child. She told Frederick in the kitchen of their cabin on a January morning while he was eating breakfast, sitting down across from him and telling him directly because she did not know how else to tell things. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he put down his cup and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands, and his expression was something she had not seen on him before, not the steady warmth she knew, but something deeper and more moved, a kind of wonder. "Are you all right?" he asked first, which was exactly the right question. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am pleased about it, are you?" He looked at her with that expression. "Yes," he said. "More than I know how to say." He kissed her hands and then her forehead and held her for a long moment in the quiet kitchen. The pregnancy was not uncomplicated. The spring of 1880 brought a difficult stretch in March when Naomi was very ill for 2 weeks. Sick beyond what was ordinary, and Frederick was afraid in a way that he kept carefully controlled, but that she saw clearly because she knew him by then, as well as she knew the mountain outside their window. He rode down to Tin Cup for the doctor, a practical man named Dr. Joseph Farrell, who came up on horseback in the cold and stayed 2 days, and said she needed rest and broth and better weather, all of which were forthcoming. Mrs. Agnes Harlow came up to stay for a week, which was an act of generosity that Naomi would not forget for the rest of her life. She brought with her enough food to feed a small ranch, an opinionated running commentary on every aspect of the cabin setup, and a quality of no-nonsense competent care that was exactly what was needed. Frederick found her slightly terrifying, and Mrs. Harlow found this enormously amusing. Naomi recovered and the spring came on properly and the garden went in, and by May she was entirely herself again, large and healthy and ready. The baby came on the 7th of June, 1880, in the cabin on the mountain with Mrs. Harlow and Dr. Farrell both present because Frederick had ridden down and brought both of them up 3 weeks early on the grounds that he was not going to take any chances, which Mrs. Harlow called excessive, and Dr. Farrell called sensible and Naomi called endearing. It was a boy, large and healthy and furiously vocal from the first moment. Frederick held him for a long time standing by the window, looking at this small, loud person with an expression that Naomi watched from the bed with a feeling she had no word for, something that was an entirely new category of feeling that apparently only became available at specific moments. "What do we call him?" Frederick said, still looking at the baby. "Thomas," Naomi said, for her brother who had gone east and who she missed and who she was going to write a proper letter to very soon. Frederick looked up at her from the baby. "Thomas Calloway," he said, and something in the way he said the name, both parts together, was the quietest and most complete expression of happiness she had ever heard from him. Thomas Calloway was not a quiet baby. He was curious and loud and extremely determined about getting what he wanted, and he grew fast and well on the mountain air and his parents' devoted attention. And by the time he was pulling himself up on the cabin furniture and launching himself unsteadily at anything within range, he had Frederick Calloway thoroughly and completely wrapped around every one of his small fingers. Frederick, who had spent years in the mountains alone, with the kind of self-sufficient quiet that a solitary life required, adapted to parenthood with a thoroughness that surprised everyone who knew him and did not surprise Naomi at all. He was endlessly patient with Thomas, in the way of a man who had learned patience from the mountains, and now applied it to a smaller and considerably louder landscape. He carried the boy on his back when he went to check his trap lines in the mornings, once Thomas was old enough, and narrated everything he saw in that low, steady voice, the birds and the tracks and the weather signs, the same things he had told Naomi that first autumn. And Thomas listened with his father's grave attentiveness, and then demolished the careful explanations with the enthusiastic chaos of a 2-year-old, and Frederick started over without complaint. Franklin Carter came to visit the summer Thomas was 1 year old. He rode up from Redemption Creek with a pack horse loaded with supplies for the cabin and a look on his face that was trying to be casual and was not quite managing it. He held his grandson for the first time standing on the south porch of the cabin with the San Juan peaks spread out in front of him, and the July sky above deep and clear, and Naomi watched her father's face change into something softer and more open than she had seen there in a very long time. He stayed 3 days. He and Frederick were careful with each other in the way of two men who respected each other without quite knowing how to express it yet. But by the second evening, they were sitting on the porch together with coffee and talking about elk migration patterns and land drainage, 2 topics on which they both had extensive opinions. And by the third morning, they were getting along with the comfortable ease of men who had found their common ground. Before he left, Franklin took Naomi aside by the creek and said, with the stiff difficulty of a man who had not done much apologizing in his life, "I have thought a good deal about what you said to me in the house that autumn." "I know," she said. "I was not right," he said. "In what I planned, I want you to know I understand that." "I know that too," she said. "It matters that you said it." He nodded. He looked at the cabin, at the garden along the east side, at Frederick loading the pack horse for the supply trip to Tin Cup that was happening that day. "He is good to you," Franklin said. "He is excellent to me," Naomi said clearly. Franklin nodded again. "Good," he said, and it came out with all the weight of a man who meant it with his whole chest. He visited twice more before he died in 1884, and those visits were better than any of the years of living under the same roof had been. Naomi grieved him properly when he went, not just for what he had been, but for what he had become toward the end, which was a better version of himself, and for the fact that Thomas had known him and had memories of a grandfather who held him and told him stories about the Animas River. Thomas Calloway, at 4 years old already, had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's chin, and a temperament that was entirely his own, a combination of fearless physical courage and a tender-hearted attention to the people he loved that made him simultaneously the most exhausting and the most rewarding person to spend a day with. He fell out of trees with remarkable frequency and without apparent distress, and he cried passionately when the cabin cat, an orange tom named Garrison who had arrived one winter and decided to stay, had a bad season with his leg and walked crookedly for a month. On a September morning in 1884, 6 years to the month from the day Naomi had walked into Frederick's camp in her ruined dress, she stood on the south porch of the cabin with her second cup of coffee and watched the morning light move across the San Juan peaks and thought about her life with the deliberate attention she gave it sometimes, the kind of thinking that was not planning or worrying but simply looking at what was there. Frederick was in the barn below the cabin, which they had built the previous year, doing the morning feeding, and she could hear Thomas in the cabin behind her talking to Garrison in a detailed monologue about something that had happened yesterday with a ground squirrel. The garden was in its last weeks, the summer's work still visible in the rows of harvested beds and the things that were still producing, the late squash and the root vegetables not yet ready. She thought about a church in Redemption Creek and a velvet curtain, and a pair of men who had spoken about her life as though she were not in the room. She thought about running. She thought about the smell of wood smoke in the mountain air, and a fire in a stone ring, and a man who said, "You are safe here," with the certainty of a fact about the landscape. Frederick came up from the barn and saw her on the porch and came toward her with that unhurried stride, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and there was a line of morning sun catching the gray that was beginning to come in at his temples. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her and took her cup from her hands and drank from it without asking, which was the habit of 6 years and which she had never minded. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, giving her the cup back. "6 years ago," she said. "September. The dress," he said. "The dress," she agreed. He looked out at the peaks for a moment. "Best thing that ever walked out of those trees," he said quietly. She leaned against him and felt his arm come around her shoulders, the solid, certain warmth of him, and she looked at the mountains they lived in and thought about the woman she had been on that September morning, running in a ruined dress without a plan, only the knowledge that something wrong was happening and the determination not to let it continue. She had found more than safety in those mountains. She had found herself. "Frederick," she said. "Yes," he said, looking at her. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I am expecting again." He was still for a moment. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh, low and warm, and he pulled her properly against him and held her. "When," he said. "Spring," she said. "March, I think." "Thomas is going to be beside himself," he said, and there was such uncomplicated delight in his voice that she laughed. "He is going to be terrifying about it," she agreed. "He will want to carry the baby everywhere immediately." "He got that from you," Frederick said. "He got that from both of us," she said. Thomas, when told that evening, was indeed beside himself, running 3 circuits of the cabin in pure kinetic joy before settling down enough to ask 17 questions in rapid succession, the most pressing of which were whether the baby would like ground squirrels and whether they could name it something that sounded good when you were calling across a meadow. "We will discuss the name when we know more," Naomi told him firmly, And then she looked at Frederick over Thomas's head, and he was watching both of them with that expression she had first seen in the church in Tin Cup, that quality of completeness, of a man who has arrived at the thing he did not know he was looking for. The second child was born in March of 1885, in the cold, bright, early spring of the Colorado Mountains, and it was a girl. They named her Eleanor, for Naomi's mother, and she had Frederick's pale green eyes from nearly the first and a gravity about her that made her seem, from the beginning, like someone taking careful notes on the world around her. Thomas, at 5 years old, was so dedicated in his devotion to his sister that the cabin cat Garrison, displaced from his position as Thomas's primary dependent, spent 2 weeks sulking on the porch in protest before accepting the new arrangement. Del Briggs, one of the men who had helped build the cabin, came to visit when Eleanor was 3 weeks old and stayed for supper and looked at the family arranged around the table in the firelight and said, with the directness of a man who did not bother with indirection, "You two have got a good life here." "Yes," Frederick said. "It suits you," Del said. "It does," Naomi said. Del looked at Frederick with the assessing quality of an old friend. "Remember when you were living in that camp with nothing but a horse and a journal and a pile of beaver pelts?" "I remember," Frederick said. "Would you go back?" Del asked. Frederick looked at Naomi across the table, and she looked back at him, and between them was everything that had happened in the years since a September afternoon when she had walked out of the trees and he had turned from his fire, and their separate lives had become this single ongoing thing. "No," Frederick said simply. After supper, when the children were in bed and Del had gone back to his own place down the valley, Naomi and Frederick sat by the fireplace in the good quiet they had perfected over 6 years of evenings. She was mending a sleeve on Thomas's jacket, which he destroyed clothing at a rate that required constant attention, and Frederick was reading from a book he had ordered through the trading post, a natural history of the Rocky Mountains that he had been working through with the absorption of a man revisiting familiar country through new eyes. The fire was warm and the mountain was quiet outside the cabin walls, and inside there was the soft sound of her needle and his occasional page-turning and the deep-settled peace of a life that had been built deliberately, day by day, out of the materials available. "Frederick," she said. He looked up from his book. "I love you," she said. Not for any particular reason except that it was true and she felt it, and saying it was one of the better uses of words she had found. He looked at her with those pale eyes that had seen her clearly from the first moment and had never stopped. "I love you," he said, "more than I know how to say most of the time." "You do not need to say it most of the time," she said. "I know." "You have always known," he said, with that slight warmth that made the corner of his eye crease. "You have always been clear," she said. He set down his book and she set down the mending, and he crossed the room and sat beside her on the settle by the fire, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she always did, feeling the solid, certain reality of him. Outside the cabin, the Colorado night was full of stars, the same stars that had been appearing above the granite outcropping the first night she had sat by his fire and drunk his coffee, and felt for the first time in months that she might be all right. The peaks were white in the moonlight, enormous and permanent, and the mountain creek was still running in its bed not far from the cabin wall, the way it always ran, steady and unhurried and certain of its direction. Inside the cabin were 2 sleeping children, and a fire, and the life that had come from a September morning when everything wrong had been traded for the possibility of everything right. Not perfect. Not without difficulty or grief or the ordinary hard work of 2 people building something together, but real and hers and chosen, and full of the specific weight of a love that had known from nearly the beginning what it was. The years would bring more of everything. More of Thomas growing into himself, that fearless, tender-hearted boy who would grow into a man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's fire. More of Eleanor taking her careful notes on the world, the girl who would grow up with mountains for her backyard and books in her hands and the understanding, absorbed from her parents without ever being told explicitly, that a life should be the shape of the person living it. More visits from Mrs. Harlow, who remained sharp and good for many years. More letters from Thomas's uncle in Philadelphia, who finally made the journey west in 1887 and stood on the south porch of the cabin and looked at the San Juan peaks and said he finally understood what Naomi had been trying to tell him in letters for years. More evenings by the fire. More mornings with coffee on the porch and the light moving over the peaks. More of the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a life lived in full. And all of it rooted in a September afternoon when a woman in a ruined white dress had followed the smell of wood smoke to a fire in the mountains, and a man had put down his rifle and offered her warmth and said she was safe, and meant it in ways that neither of them fully understood yet, but that would take a lifetime to explore and still leave more to discover. That was the whole of it and the heart of it. A beginning built on honesty, and an ending that was not an ending at all, but simply the deep-settled continuation of two people who had chosen each other clearly and kept choosing, day after day, through all the seasons of the San Juan Mountains and all the years that the mountains held. Naomi Carter had run away from a wrong life on a September morning in 1878, in a ruined dress and borrowed shoes, without a plan or a direction, only the certainty that something different must be possible. She had been right.